Joshua, back in Joshua chapter 11, Joshua and Israel are battling in the northern part of Israel. Remember, I say Israel, I mean the land of Canaan. Today we call it Israel. It's the nation of Israel. But then it was the land that belonged to the Canaanites. They were the peoples that lived there, the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, all these different people groups. And these are the ones that Joshua and the armies of Israel went in to destroy. If you look at that map, remember that red line that just came across on the map on the left, that was where God had Israel go in initially. Jericho, you can see, well, I don't know if you can read it, but it says Jericho right there, and then Ai and Bethel and Gilgal. This is the area that Israel moved into the land first. And you can see that they split it in half. That's almost exactly geographically in the middle of the land. So we've had Joshua in Joshua chapter 10 fighting all these battles in the south, and now he's gone to the north and he's defeating all the major cities and all the kings in the north. And that's what we read about here. In Joshua chapter 11 verse 12, look what it says. In Joshua 11 verse 12. It says, Joshua captured all the cities of these kings and all their kings, and he struck them with the edge of the sword, and he utterly destroyed them, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. Remember, God spoke to Moses face to face, and then Moses gave the instruction to Joshua, you need to go in, and especially these 7 people groups, and he names them over and over, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite, the Canaanite, all these people, the Amorite. He says of those people you're to kill them, and I mean kill everything that breathes. So that's what we're talking about here. But I want you to pay attention to this phrase in Joshua 11:12, of these kings. It says Joshua captured all the cities of these kings. You got to think, you have to keep this in mind while we're going through this, that as Joshua is leading the entire army of Israel, one army, all of Israel's fighting men are in one army right now, and Joshua leads them. When Joshua finishes leading the one army, there are still people in the land that need to be exterminated. There are still a lot of Canaanites and Perizzites and people in Hebron and giants, the Anakim. There are still a lot of people that need slowly to be killed by the tribes of Israel. What Joshua and his army did was go in and cut off the head of the snake. What Joshua and his army did is they went into the land of Canaan and they made it impossible for the land of Canaan and the people of Canaan to rise up against Israel and kick Israel out. They cut off the head of the snake. The body of the snake still needed to be killed. There were still many, many people that needed to be killed by smaller groups of Jews, by the tribal groups as they went out and took their different parts of land. What I'm trying to say is up here where Asher is and Tyre and Sidon and this Mediterranean coast, when Joshua finishes the conquest in this chapter, there are still a lot of people up there that God needs to be killed. What Joshua and his army have done is taken the head of the snake off. They've killed all the kings and they've defeated the major cities. There are still little cities and villages and townships. Well, I say townships. They didn't have that word then. There are still people in the hillsides, in the countries, in the desert. There are still Canaanites, if you will, that need to be killed. I say that because you're going to see here, and Joshua took all of the land, and Joshua defeated all of the kings. It doesn't mean all in the sense that we think of all. What it means is that Joshua killed all the major kings, the kings that were in authority, and Joshua killed and destroyed all the people of the major cities. I'll give you an example from today. If you wanted to destroy the United States of America, you'd have to go to Washington and wipe out Washington first, right? You'd have to cut the head of the snake off. You'd have to cut the U.S. military off as best as you could. You'd have to cripple the Pentagon somehow. You'd have to go to the states. You'd have to kill the state buildings. You'd have to kill the governors. You'd have to kill all the people that are under the governors that have authority to mobilize armies, militias in different states. That's what Joshua did. Joshua killed the president, the vice president, the cabinet. Joshua killed the governors of the states. Joshua killed all the military leaders of the states, so that now all he had was citizens to fight. You get the point? All he had was citizens left. The major authorities had been taken out. However, it says in verse 13, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds, except Hazor alone, which Joshua burned. I showed you what this idea of a city on a mound is. The Hebrew word for this is tel, T-E-L, tel, like the city Tel Aviv. And what the tail is that big hump back there in the back. What you see in the foreground here, maybe I didn't explain it too well, is an ancient city called Beit Shan. It's in the central area. Back here on this map, Beit Shan is like right here in the H of Manasseh, somewhere right in this area. Well, it was an actual city that came around after the days of Jesus, but they didn't destroy that mound in the back. That mound represented civilization after civilization after civilization. I forget how many exactly they said stood on that mound, but that mound is a Jewish tell. So you have an ancient peoples from thousands of years ago that built their city there at ground level. And hundreds of years go by, that civilization crumbles, and other people would come in, and on this crumbled rock, they built their new city. And 100 or so years would go by, and that civilization would crumble, or 200 years. And on those crumblings, the new civilization would build a city. And they just kept building civilization on top of civilization until you get this thing that in Israel is called a tell. The city of Tel Aviv is named not because there's a tell in Tel Aviv, but it's because it's a very historically Jewish thing, that you have these mounds, these cities that are built atop the ruins of another city. So that's what it means there. This is exactly what it means there, that they didn't burn any of the cities that stood on their mounds. Why? Possibly because they had historical value. We're not told that God told them not to do it. We just know that Joshua didn't do it. Maybe he saw the historical value there and wanted to preserve it. He didn't want to tear down all the statues, because the statues have meaning. They have historical value, and so he left the tells there. In verse 14, let's continue. It says, all the spoil of these cities. Remember, not every person, not every town, not every village, but the major cities is what we're talking about. All the spoil of these cities and all the cattle the sons of Israel took as their plunder, but they struck every man in these cities with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. They left no one who breathed. So if you just read that, you'd have the impression, well, every pagan, every idolater in the land of Canaan is now killed. That's not the truth. Only the major cities and the major kings, the head of the snake, has been cut off. Verse 15 goes on and says, just as the Lord had commanded Moses, his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua. Now Moses is dead. You know that. Moses didn't cross the river with the sons of Israel. But before that, Moses gave Joshua word from God about killing everyone that breathed. And so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So that's the picture here. In chapter 11, verse 15, the major battles of the one united army of Israel under their leader, their captain Joshua, have now come to an end. The conquests are finished. The one army of Israel, in Joshua chapter 11, verse 15, is done fighting. They don't go out again. It's over. The conquests that Joshua led of one army marching around Canaan, destroying people, killing everything in the city that breathed, burning most cities. That's finished. But there's a lot of killing left to do. There are a lot of pagan idolaters left in the land. It's just the major cities. In verse 16, I say that because in verse 16 we shift. And what we see here is a review of all the victories that Israel had. It goes back to the other side of the Jordan River now. All these battles are taking place. Here's the Jordan River right here. And all these battles in Joshua chapter 10 and chapter 11 are taking place in the Promised Land. But now in verse 16, he goes back to this side of the Jordan River, and he goes back to when they started these wars, and he gives a review. The conquests are over. This is just review. It becomes history now. Look what it says in verse 16. Thus Joshua took all the land. I think I've told you enough to know that Joshua did not defeat every square inch of land yet. He took the major cities. He cut the head of the snake off. But all the land was able to be conquered now. All the land was able to be killed and defeated by the small tribal armies because of what Joshua did in cutting off the snake. There were no more authorities in the land of Canaan that could rise up that could kick Israel out of the land. Israel is home. Israel is home to stay. They're in the promised land. And the authorities that could kick them out, that had the firepower to do it, are all dead now. So Joshua took all the land, the hill country, the Negev. The Negev is a desert area way down south, the hill country, the Judean hill country. This is Judah. The Judean hill country is all this area south of Jerusalem. Just giving you a geography. He took all the land of Goshen, the lowland, the Arabah, the hill country of Israel, and its lowland from Mount Halak that rises towards Seir, even as far as Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon at the foot of Mount Hermon. Now he's gone way up here to the north. Modern day Lebanon is up here where it says Hittite. Mount Hermon is way up here in the north. So he's just going north to south, east to west. He's naming different places, saying that all of the land of Canaan, Joshua's army had stepped foot in and had cut off the head of the snake. The major authority figures are now dead. He captured all of their kings and he struck them down and he put them to death. Verse 18 says, Joshua waged war a long time with all these kings. Anybody know how long? How many years the book of Joshua covers? Up to this point? 7 years is the answer. 7 years have gone by. I'm going to just show you a little bit of this in this slide. Look at what has gone on in the last 7 years. Israel crosses the Jordan River. Remember, it was a miracle. God caused the Jordan River to be walled up, and Israel crossed into the land of Canaan on dry ground. In Joshua chapter 6, Jericho falls, the first battle, a miracle, where God has the armies of Israel march around the city 7 days in a row, and on the seventh day they marched around 7 times. The priests of Israel blew their trumpets. The people of Israel shouted out loud and the walls of Jericho fell down. This was not a military battle. This was God's battle. Joshua's army didn't lift a finger to destroy the walls of Jericho. They didn't fight to take Jericho. God simply gave Jericho into their hands. That happens in chapter 6. Israel loses in chapter 7. Israel loses to Ai, a city called Ai. Remember, it was because Achan, a Jew, had stolen things that God said to destroy. Achan took some of the plunder. God said in Jericho, don't take anything. It's all under the ban. It's all been decreed to be destroyed. And Achan saw something that he liked, the shiny things I like to call them. And Achan took some silver, some gold, and he took it for himself. And because of that, in chapter 7, when Israel behind Joshua go into battle at Ai, they get turned away, they lose. And it's because of Achan. He had stolen some things. We get to chapter 8, things with Achan are cleared up, they kill him. And Ai falls in chapter 8. These are some of the things that happened in these 7 years. The city of Ai falls. The men of Gibeon, remember in chapter 9, the men of Gibeon tricked Joshua. They're right next door. They're 7 miles down the road from Ai, but they come along in all their tattered clothes with their old stale bread, and they say, we've traveled from hundreds of miles. We're from a very far country. Please make peace with us. And Joshua falls for their trick, their manipulation, and silly, foolish Joshua on that day makes peace with the men of Gibeon in chapter 9. Now, here's the fact of all those things. 1 year has gone by. All those things happened in 1 year. 1 year has gone by since Israel crossed the Jordan River on dry ground in chapter 3. In 1 year, Jericho falls, Ai falls, the men of Gibeon trick Joshua. That happens in 1 year. That year is 1406 BC. 1406 BC is the year in which that takes place. From Joshua chapter 1 all the way to Joshua chapter 9, 1 year, 1406 BC. I got to go to a new screen. You ready? We got to shift to Joshua chapter 10. The slide continues. Just trying to show you, it says that it took a long time. Joshua waged war a long time with all these kings. In Joshua chapter 10, we get to the southern campaign. Remember the red line that crossed Israel in the middle? Everything south of that line happens in chapter 10. In chapter 10, Joshua goes and he kills all the major cities and all the major kings and all the men of war that lived in those cities. He kills everything that breathes, and that's Joshua chapter 10. Joshua chapter 11, which is where we are right now, everything north of that red line Joshua is destroying. And then in Joshua chapter 11, verse 16, he begins this review of his battles. A review of the battles. Let's look back and see what we've done, because by Joshua chapter 11, verse 15, the battles are finished. The conquest is over. So Joshua chapters 10 and 11, the fighting south of the line and the fighting north of the line take place over the following 6 years. From 1406, the next 6 years are Joshua chapter 10 and Joshua chapter 11. A 6-year period. Israel's a little place. It's a postcard in the geographic sense. Tiny. Like the size of New Jersey. Only slightly larger than our state of New Jersey. So you see 6 years, you say, why did it take 6 years? Couldn't it have been done quicker? He was marching an army of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men over very serious mountainous terrain. So no, it took 6 years for Joshua chapter 10 and Joshua chapter 11 to occur. 6 years went by. So that's verse 18. Joshua waged war a long time with all these kings. I just wanted to give you a timeline of what we're talking about. 1 year for Jericho and Ai and Bethel and the Gibeon disaster. And then 6 years for chapter 10 and 11, the southern and northern campaigns. We go on to verse 19. There was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel except the Hivites living in Gibeon. We just went over that. You remember the story, the tattered clothes and the stale bread and all the rest. They took them all in battle. Not another city made peace with Joshua. Joshua learned his lesson. I need to listen to God. I need to do exactly what God told me to do. I need to kill everything that breathes. And I need to not be fooled by anyone. So he wasn't fooled again. No one came to Joshua offering peace like the Gibeons did again. So in the next 6 years, Joshua was nothing but a military leader who killed everything that breathed. Verse 20 says, for it was of the Lord. Now listen to this. It says in 19, there was not a city which made peace with Israel. And you say, why? Wouldn't there have been anybody else in Israel that said, wait a minute, or in the land of Canaan, that said, wait a minute, this army of Israel can't be stopped. Everywhere they go, they're killing the kings. They're killing armies stronger than them. They're destroying all the men, women, and children in the city. Don't you think there was anybody else in the land of Canaan that said, we want to try to trick Israel too. We want to try to live like the men of Gibeon? Don't you think it's human nature that someone else might try to say, let's try to fool them into not fighting us the way the men of Gibeon did? What's the answer? I would think yes, certain people were going to try to make peace with Israel, except for what we learn in verse 20. Look at what it says in verse 20. It was Yahweh. Oh, so God got involved. Yes, God got directly involved in the hearts of these pagans, these Canaanites. Not a city, there was not a city of men that made peace with Israel. Why? Because Yahweh hardened their hearts to meet Israel in battle, in order that He might utterly destroy them, that they might receive no mercy, but that He might destroy them just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So from verse 20 we get this idea that maybe some of the people did want to try to trick Israel. But the Lord hardened their hearts so that they would come out and fight Israel instead of seeking peace with Israel, because God wanted them all dead and Israel might foolishly show them mercy. So remember what's going on here. We don't have a mean God. We have a loving God. We have a God who's graciously given these people in the land of Canaan the last 400 years. 400 years of grace. Worship me. You heard of what I done. Remember when Joshua sent 2 spies into Jericho and they met a prostitute. What was her name? The harlot. Rahab. Remember what Rahab knew about Israel? She heard about the 10 plagues. They had heard about how He dried up the Red Sea. They heard about how they'd killed King Og and King Bashan across the Jordan River. Word was out about the power of Yahweh, the one true God. And God had given these people 400 years to bow to Him. Walk away from your idols, your false gods, and understand that by what I have done on this earth, what I have shown to be true, that I've shown myself to be a promise keeper to my people, that I've shown myself clearly to be more powerful than any God you worship. Fall on your knees and worship me. 400 years of grace. But they didn't want it. They didn't take it. The people in the land of Canaan, these groups that God said kill everything that breathes, had utterly rejected 400 years of God's love and grace and provision. For 400 years He kept them alive. He kept their crops growing. He kept their animals alive. They lived on earth for 400 years. That is grace. They rejected Yahweh, and now Yahweh is cleansing the land. He wants all of them gone because He's going to start with His people Israel in purity, in a cleansed land with no idolatry, no altars that have been made to false gods, no sacrificial places, no temples. Tear down all of that garbage. We're starting purely with my nation Israel in a pure land, worshiping me in a pure way according to the law of Moses that I've given you in the tabernacle, etc. That's what God's doing here. So the people of Canaan, these people refused to worship Yahweh even though they knew what He did for them at the Red Sea. They knew how He dried the Jordan River. They knew of the miracle at Jericho, how those walls came tumbling down. They knew it. They refused to bow to this God. And God doesn't want Israel to show them any mercy. He doesn't want them to foolishly be tricked. So it says that Yahweh hardened the hearts of all these people in the land of Canaan so they would fight Israel and die in battle. But what does that mean that God hardened their hearts? We've looked at this before when we talked about Pharaoh. Oh, a slide, a principle, very quickly. I said that they knew that God dried up the Red Sea. They knew that God had dried up the Jordan River. They knew that God had miraculously defeated the city of Jericho. But here's the thought: miracles don't cause great faith. These Canaanites, because Rahab knew it, and she's a Canaanite from Jericho. She lived in the land of Canaan, and she knew of Yahweh, the one true God. Miracles don't cause great faith. They had miracles that should have led them to God, that should have led them to this Yahweh. They should have given up all their false gods who'd never done a single miracle and worshiped this miracle-making God. Yes? But they didn't. Because miracles don't cause great faith. Great faith comes from a settled conviction that God is trustworthy. And that's the story of Rahab. That's the difference in a woman like Rahab who had faith in what God had done and what He could do, and that He kept His promises to Israel. He said He'd protect these people, and I've seen Him do it. I've heard of the way He's done it. I will worship this God. I'm tempted to take a rabbit trail for a second. Well, here we go. Let me just give you an example from the Scripture that miracles don't cause great faith. In Luke chapter 16, just listen to the story. You know what I'm talking about. There was a rich man named Lazarus. There was a rich man, and then there was a beggar named Lazarus. Now, this is not the Lazarus that Jesus rose from the dead, that He brought back from the dead. That was a different Lazarus. There are a lot of people with the same names in the Bible. But there was a rich man in Luke chapter 16 who had everything. He had all the food. He had the big banquets. And Lazarus would come around, and maybe the king would drop a crumb off the table while he was eating. And Lazarus, like a dog, would eat the crumbs off the floor. Well, both of these men die. The rich man goes to hell. Lazarus goes to heaven. And there's a story of this being in the center of the earth, a place called torments or Sheol. This place that's in the center of the earth, because Luke chapter 16 starts telling this part of the story. It says what happens after death to these two people. And what happens is that the rich man is in the place called torments. He's in hell, which is only temporary until they all get tossed into the lake of fire in the future. Every unbeliever is still in hell right now. And then across this great gulf, there was this man Lazarus, this beggar, who on earth had had nothing. But now he's in a place the Bible calls Abraham's bosom. He's in heaven. Not in the heavens, not in the third heaven, but he's in the place where believers were before Jesus went and took them to heaven with Him after He was resurrected. So here's the way the story goes. Because miracles don't cause great faith. The rich man is in torments with the heat, and he sees Abraham across the great gulf, and he asks Abraham for just a drop of water to cool my tongue, and Abraham says it can't be done. You had to choose while you were on earth which of these places you would go to. You chose this one, Lazarus chose this one. Belief in God was the difference. Faith in Jesus Christ was the difference. I can't. There's a great gulf fixed between us. And this is what the rich man said. Then have someone come out of the grave, a miracle, and go tell my brothers, so that my brothers won't make the mistake and make the decisions I did and end up where I am in this hell. Raise someone out of the grave. Do a miracle. If my brothers see a miracle, then they will have faith. And Abraham says, no, they won't. Because miracles don't cause great faith. Miracles in the unbelieving world aren't going to make an unbeliever necessarily say, oh, God did that great miracle. There's only one God, the one that did the miracle. I'll fall down and worship. And that's not what we see in the Bible. What we see in the Bible is that men often overlook miracles. I mean, goodness, Jesus Christ was the miracle doer of miracle doers. Did Israel accept their Messiah, Jesus? The one who walked on water, the one who gave sight to the blind, the one who healed the lame, the one who rose the dead to new life? Did they fall down because Jesus was a miracle maker? The one who fed 5,000 with 2 loaves of bread and 5 little fish, did they fall down and follow and have faith in Jesus Christ because He was a miracle worker? No is the answer. Miracles don't cause great faith in the world of unbelief. Great faith doesn't come from a miracle God does. Great faith comes from a settled conviction based on the truth of the Bible and who we know God to be, that He is trustworthy. That's faith. I believe this God is trustworthy, and I have faith in Him because of what He's shown me over and over. And these people in Canaan, to bring it back around, these people in Canaan had the parting of the Red Sea, God protecting Israel. They had the parting of the Jordan River, God protecting Israel. They had the fall of the walls of Jericho, God protecting Israel. And it didn't change their faith one bit. They rejected this God. They rejected His people Israel. They did not come around to worship Yahweh. And so after 400 years of them making their decision, we do not love your God. As a matter of fact, we reject your God entirely, Israel, and we will fight you to the death. God says, if you want it that way, friends, you got it. He didn't make their decisions for them. I'm saying all this because God did not harden their hearts and cause them, make them, against their will, fight Israel. They hated God and they hated His people Israel, and they wanted to defeat them in battle. Remember this picture? So God greased the slide. The men of Canaan had walked up that slide. They saw the miracles. They saw Jericho. They saw God protect Israel. They saw Israel, no doubt, be the people of God. They kept in rejection and unbelief walking up the slide until at the top of the slide they say, we want Israel gone. And God says, good. If that's the road you want to go on, I'm going to grease this slide that you want to go down. I'm going to make it easier for you to fight Israel. So God didn't cause them to harden their hearts against Him. They had chosen that path. God simply greased the slide. And what I mean by that is He made it easier for them to continue down the path of hatred for Israel that they had already chosen. And He made them then, He hardened their hearts so that they would fight Israel in battle. No more peace. Don't come asking for peace. Don't come begging for mercy. Come out with arms so that when we fight you, when Israel fights you and defeats you, it'll be exactly as I wanted. Hard-heartedness. Let's take a look at this just for a minute. Running out of time. Just some characteristics of these people in Canaan. What is hard-heartedness? It's a selfish stubbornness. A selfish stubbornness born of arrogance. What does God have to show you for you to understand that He's more powerful than you? That He's more powerful than any of your false gods? But men reject that. They reject these obvious miracles. And they fight Israel. A selfish stubbornness that's born out of arrogance, born out of pride. What else is hard-heartedness? It's a consequence of self-will. High-mindedness and pride which flow from sin. These people wanted to do things their way. They didn't want to be part of the Jewish nation. They didn't want to worship the Jewish God. They wanted to kill Israel. That's self-will. High-mindedness. They thought their gods could defeat the God Yahweh. Insanity. They were insensible to the voice of God. You say, did they hear God speak? No, but they saw God's actions. They knew of the Red Sea. They saw the River Jordan dry up. And they saw and heard of the city of Jericho fall down. But they were insensible to God's voice. It made no sense to them. It didn't affect them. It didn't prick their consciences. They didn't care. They were hard-hearted. They ignored God's actions on earth. and also hard-heartedness. They were insensible to impressions or divine influences. Not even the 10 plagues from God that changed Pharaoh's heart, or not even 10 plagues from God changed Pharaoh's heart. They're just like Pharaoh. God did all those miracle after miracle before Pharaoh. It didn't cause Pharaoh to have faith in God. It didn't change him a bit. It hardened him more and more and more. God did the miracle, and it caused Pharaoh's heart to harden. It's the same thing we have here. I'm going out down this big road only to make you see that God moved them forward in their desire to destroy Israel by making them fight Israel in battle. That was God's part. Don't try to manipulate them. Don't try to get around this. You take up arms and you fight my people Israel because I want them to destroy you in battle. He didn't allow them to seek peace and mercy from Israel. God did not allow these nations to seek peace and mercy from Israel the way He had allowed the Gibeonites to do it. He shut that door. He did not allow these people to seek peace and mercy from Israel. He made them fight war with Israel so that they would be destroyed. Another question. Is this what God wanted for the people of Canaan? Did God want, for in these days, these 7 years, did God want for Israel to have to go into Canaan and kill everything that breathed? Was that a desire from the heart of God and the plan of God from eternity past? Is that what He wanted for the Canaanites? Or do you think God wanted them to turn to Him and worship Him? Look what it says in Ezekiel chapter 33 concerning God's heart. This is God speaking. Don't miss the voice. This is God. Say to them, as I live, declares Yahweh, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked. Have you ever read that verse? We don't have a God that wants to go in and kill all the Canaanites and have their blood splattered all over the land of Canaan. That's not God's heart. He does it because He's pure justice. And if you reject God long enough, well, He's going to act. But that's not His heart. That's not what He desires. The Bible says, God speaking it, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked. But rather, what is God's desire? What's His heart? But rather that the wicked turn from his way and live. What did God want from the Canaanites? Worship. The same thing He wants from you, the same thing He wants from me. God created man to worship Him, not to reject Him, to accept Him, to accept His love, to accept His offer of a deliverer, a Messiah, and to live in peace and harmony with Him. Certainly in the Old Testament that's true. Obey God and be blessed. It was simple. But He takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. He wants the wicked to turn from his wicked ways and live. And He says, turn back from your evil ways. As if He's pleading with the heart of man. Why don't you want what I want to give you? I want a relationship with you. I don't want to destroy you and send you to hell. Did God create hell to fill it with human beings who rejected Him? I'll ask it again. Not enough answers. Did God create hell and the eternal lake of fire because He wanted people to reject Him and go there? Is that why God created that hell? Or do we have a God who wants all people to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth? Did God want Jesus Christ to save every human being who's ever lived? What's the answer? Yes is the answer to that question. So why did God create hell? Then why is there hell, Rick? Listen to the verse. From Matthew 25, verse 41. You can write it down in a second. Just listen to it. Then Jesus will say to those on the left, "Depart from me, you cursed ones, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels." Who did God create the everlasting fire for? Men? No. No, God did not design hell, and the hell, which is a temporary holding place, and the lake of fire, which is an eternal holding place. He didn't design them for men. The Bible says He designed them for the devil and his demons. Men, by their own foolish choice, reject the free offer of Messiah, and they say, "I would rather go to hell than bow down and worship that God." Matthew 25:41. And that, friends, thank God, and I mean thank Almighty God, that is not our heart. Our heart wants to worship the living God. Our heart wants to come in humility and bow down and listen to the living God speak to us through the Bible. Most of the world in the land of Canaan in Joshua's day and in our world today say, "I would rather go to hell than bow down and worship your God." Wow. Your God's not real. There is no heaven, there is no hell. But if there is, I'd rather be apart from Him than with Him, because how could a loving God allow all this evil to take place in the world? And I go back to the Garden of Eden and say, buddy, God didn't write any of this. Your father Adam and my father Adam wrote the evil into the script. God didn't do that. Adam did. And he's my father. I bear his DNA. Humanity wrote evil into the script. That wasn't God's initial play. God doesn't desire that men be lost. God desires that men be saved. Turn back from your evil ways. Why then will you die, O house of Israel? But as I said, God is a God of perfect justice. And so when you reject God, He will reject you. It says, and if by these things, now I don't mean the believer, I mean for the unbelieving world. And if by these things you are not turned to me, when I bring discipline to you, Israel, and you don't turn back, this is for believing Israel. But even with believers, God is a God of judgment. He has to be, because He's perfectly just. He can't just sit by and let people reject Him. He says, if you do these things, or if by these things you don't turn back to me, but you act with hostility against me, then I will act with hostility against you. You want it like that, Israel? You got it. We can go either way. We can live in perfect harmony with each other, or we can live rejecting each other. We can do either one. Why would anybody choose to reject God and live with a God who says, I will act with hostility against you? Who would say, yeah, God, that's what I want? Who would do that? The children of Israel. And every one of us, every time we sin and choose to do it our own way, we're inviting God to discipline us. It's a crazy, crazy thing that we do. So, to get back into the story, why did God kill all the Canaanites? It's not because He relished in it. It says, God says, I do not take pleasure in the death of the wicked. Why did God kill all the Canaanites? Because He needed to cleanse the land. And He was going to settle Israel, the people, the nation of Israel, in the land, and He needed to remove their temptation from worshiping false gods. And the Canaanites would not worship Yahweh, they worshiped false gods. And God knows the heart of all man, and knew, if I leave the temptation in the land, these Jews will fall for it. It won't be long before these Jews are worshiping their gods. The the Canaanites will not start worshiping me. The bad apple ruins the bunch. The good apple of Israel is not going to make all these pagans who I've given grace for 400 years, who've rejected me for 400 years, Israel and their little tabernacle and the great miracles of Yahweh are not going to change their minds. We've already seen that. They are going to change Israel's minds. They're going to tempt my Jews into worshiping false gods. And because of that, I'm going to kill them all. And that's why God cleanses the land. It's not a pleasurable act. It's not a God licking his chops when Joshua's swords go into Canaanites. It's a necessary act. It's not pleasurable. Don't misinterpret God in what he does here. He takes no pleasure. He says it clearly in Ezekiel chapter 33. He does it to cleanse the land so that Israel can worship him and their hearts won't be tempted to go worship false gods. Verse 21 back in the book. Joshua came at that time and he cut off the Anakim from the hill country. These are the giants. The Anak was a giant. The Anakim are the giants. So remember, this is still a review of what he had done. Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. Now that does not mean that Joshua killed every single giant. You say, but it sounds like it does. He killed them in their major cities. Now why do I say that? Why do I have proof of that? Because in Joshua chapter 14, a man that I named my son after comes back into the story, and Caleb says, give me the hill that God promised to me in the days of Moses when I was a good spy. I'm 85 years old, but I still have enough grit to go and fight battle. I'm as strong as I was 45 years ago. Give me that hill where the giants live, and we'll see if God will let me defeat them. And we see that that Caleb goes and defeats the giants in Hebron, in the surrounding hillside around Hebron. Joshua killed the main force. Joshua and his unified army killed, as I've said 3 or 5 times, cut the head off the snake. There were still other giants that needed killed. Caleb went in and killed a slew of them and took his land from them. Who were the Anakim, the giants the first generation were afraid of? Here we see that Joshua utterly destroyed the giants. And I'm going to show you this verse because 40 years ago it was these people. Look what it says in Numbers 13. These are the spies that had come back, the 10 spies. Remember, they sent in 12 spies. 10 were bad and 2 were good. Caleb and Joshua were the good spies. But the 10 fearful spies, they were afraid of these giants. There also we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, are part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. What I'm saying is, the spies said, we can't go in and take the land because of the giants. And here in verse 21 we say Joshua didn't have any problem with the giants. Joshua destroyed the giants in all their major cities. Was there anything to fear? Did the spies have anything to fear, or could God's army defeat the giants? Yes, God's army could defeat the giants. They had nothing to fear. Verse 22, let's keep going just a minute. Let's finish. There were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel. If you stop there, you say, well, he killed them all. No, keep reading. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod some remained. The land of the sons of Israel. Underline that. It's the first time in the Bible the land of Canaan is called the land of the sons of Israel. Up until this time, it's been the land of Canaan. But now all of a sudden, it belongs to Israel. Israel has seated themselves. They have been planted by God in the land of Canaan. It is now the land of the sons of Israel. Joshua has cut off the head of the snake sufficiently enough to where the Canaanite armies cannot raise up and kick Israel out of the land. They no longer have the power to do that. Israel is in the land to stay, if only they would obey God. Gaza and Gath and Ashdod. Only in Gaza. In Gath and Ashdod. This is not good. Joshua should have killed them all, but he left some giants in the land. You know what people live? What famous people would come after this? That lived in the areas of Gaza and Gath and Ashdod, which were Mediterranean sea towns along the Mediterranean coast. You know what peoples came from these people? Starts with a P. David fought them all the time. The Philistines. The Philistines. Huge problem that Joshua caused here by not killing them all, by leaving some of these giants. There was a very famous Philistine who would cause trouble in the future. What was his name? 1 Samuel chapter 17. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines, namely Goliath. Was he a giant? Yes. Where's he from? Gath. Who left the giants in Gath alive? Joshua. Come on, Josh. Come on. He caused trouble for Israel generations down the road by not destroying everyone. But if you look at the first line, it looks like he did. There were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel except for these. So you have to let the Bible keep telling its story. When you see Joshua took the whole land, look what it says in verse 23. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. Joshua did not take all the land. Joshua made it possible for all the land to be lived in by Israel after further battles would take place. He cut the head of the snake off. The authority in the land is now Israel and Israel's army and Israel's God Yahweh. And then the last part of it says, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel, according to their divisions, by their tribes. Thus the land had rest from war. So again, one more statement. From the standpoint of one organized army of Israel, moving around the land of Canaan as one army with one general, Joshua, the war is over. He destroyed the major cities of the land, but there were many more pieces of land that needed to be taken. Look what it says in Joshua chapter 13, verse 1. Now when Joshua was old and advanced in years, when Yahweh said to him, you are old and advanced in years, and look what God says, very much of the land remains to be possessed. He cut the head off the snake. He destroyed the kings in their major cities. The hillsides, the Negev, the deserts, the coastlands. There was very much more for the tribal armies of Israel to destroy. We'll pick up there next time. Father, thank you for the time you give us to look into your word, Lord.